When my dad passed away, it felt like the world shattered into a million little pieces. There's no guidebook for what you're supposed to do when you lose someone so integral to your life. You'd think I'd be used to change by now. My parents divorced when I was 14. And I had learned how to split my life into two halves, one with dad, and one with mom. I guess I thought there would always be more time with dad. But I was wrong. His death was sudden, heart attack in the middle of the night. No warning, no time for goodbyes. One day, he was there, cracking jokes over the phone, telling me how proud he was of my new promotion at work. And the next, he was gone, just like that. My whole body ached with the weight of losing him. And I hadn't even figured out how to start grieving before the rest of my life started crumbling too. It all started with a phone call from my mom. "I need you to come over," she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. Nothing like the woman who'd once bandaged my knees after I'd fallen off my bike. I drove over, figuring she needed help planning the funeral or sorting out some paperwork. Dad wasn't just a man. He was a legacy, a small business owner, a community figure, the kind of person who left a big shadow behind. I figured Mom would need help navigating all of that. I hadn't spent much time at her house in recent years. It was awkward, trying to balance my relationship with both of my parents after the divorce. Dad and I had stayed close, but Mom and I, well, things were different. She'd moved on quickly after the split, something that had been a sore spot for me back then. When I pulled into the driveway of her house, I saw a moving truck parked out front. The sight of it made my heart sink. I hadn't expected to see that. I let myself inside and found her in the living room, where she was standing over a stack of cardboard boxes. She didn't look up when I entered. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to make sense of the scene. It looked like she was in the middle of packing up. "We're getting rid of some things," she replied curtly, barely glancing at me. "It's time to clear out your dad's stuff." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Already?" I stammered. "It's only been a couple of weeks." "Exactly. It's been long enough." She tossed a set of framed photos into the box like they were nothing more than scraps of paper. I stood frozen, watching her throw away everything that reminded me of him, the old guitar he used to strum on Sundays, the clock that had hung on the wall of his study for as long as I could remember, the framed certificates from his work that I'd always been proud of. All of it was disappearing into those boxes. "You can't just throw away his things," I protested, my voice rising with panic. "That's Dad's stuff. It's all I have left of him." Mom didn't even flinch. She just sighed, as if I were a child having a tantrum over spilled milk. "Sweetie, it's just stuff. We can't live in the past." "Stuff?" I repeated, incredulous. "This is Dad's life. You can't just erase it like this." She finally stopped what she was doing and turned to look at me. Her expression unreadable. I could see the impatience flickering in her eyes, like I was holding her up from something more important. "I'm not erasing anything," she said, her tone cold and detached. "But I need to move on. And I can't do that if I'm surrounded by all of this." It was like a slap in the face. Move on? From Dad? How could she even say that out loud? Let alone act on it so soon? My chest tightened with anger and confusion. "That's not moving on," I said through clenched teeth. "That's pretending he never existed." She crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're being dramatic." I opened my mouth to argue, to yell, to scream, but something held me back. I looked around the room at all of the boxes, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. There was more than just Dad's stuff packed away. Some of my childhood things were mixed in there too, old photos of us as a family, the quilt my grandmother had made when I was born, even some of the books I used to read with Dad before bed. It wasn't just his life she was erasing, it was mine too. I felt dizzy with the weight of it all, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "I'm not letting you do this," I said, my voice firm. "If you're going to throw away Dad's things, then I'm taking them. I'll take all of it." Mom sighed again, but this time it was more of an exasperated huff. "Look, if you want to keep some of this junk, fine, but you'll need to take it today. I'm not keeping it here any longer." I stared at her in disbelief. She really was serious about this, about erasing every trace of Dad. And then, like a punchline to a cruel joke, the front door opened, and in walked Roger. Roger, my mom's boyfriend. I hadn't seen much of him over the past few years. Mom had started dating him shortly after the divorce, and I'd done my best to keep my distance. He was nice enough, I suppose, but there was something about him that always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he'd swooped in and replaced Dad so effortlessly. Or maybe it was the fact that he was now standing in my childhood home, wearing a smug smile as if he owned the place. "What's going on in here?" Roger asked, his voice chipper as he surveyed the boxes. "We're just clearing out some space," Mom replied, her tone suddenly warm and pleasant. The stark contrast in how she spoke to him versus me was like a slap in the face. Roger clapped his hands together. "Great idea. We've been talking about making some changes around here, haven't we, babe?" I felt bile rise in my throat. Changes? They were already talking about redecorating, about making this place theirs. It was like my dad had never even existed. "I'll help with the heavy lifting," Roger said, oblivious to the tension in the room. He started grabbing boxes, stacking them near the door like he was doing us all a favor. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed out of the house, my heart pounding, my head spinning. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Tears blurred my vision, but I blinked him away. I couldn't cry, not here, not now. Over the next few weeks, I did everything I could to get Dad's belongings out of that house. I rented a storage unit, packed up whatever I could salvage, and made endless trips back and forth. Mom didn't care. She barely spoke to me as I hauled away pieces of my father's life, of my life. She was too busy with Roger, planning their new life together. It felt like a betrayal, like she was choosing him over me, over Dad, over everything we had once been as a family. And maybe she was. Maybe that's just how it goes when people move on. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I spent hours in that storage unit, surrounded by boxes of Dad's things, trying to piece together some semblance of comfort. His old leather jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne. His books, filled with notes scribbled in the margins. The clock from his study, now ticking away in the eerie silence. I held onto those things like they were lifelines. But deep down, I knew they weren't enough. Nothing could fill the void he'd left behind. Time passed, and the pain dulled, but it never went away. I still dreamt about him sometimes, about sitting with him in the backyard, listening to him tell stories about his younger days. In those dreams, he was still alive, still part of my world. And then I'd wake up, and the reality of his absence would hit me all over again. Eventually, I stopped going to Mom's house. I couldn't bear to see what it had become. I knew Roger had moved in, and they were playing house like nothing had ever happened. It hurt too much to think about. So I just didn't. I focused on my life, on my career, on building something of my own. But the wound was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for moments of quiet to remind me that it had never really healed. I wish I could say that Mom and I patched things up, that we had some heartfelt conversation where we cried and hugged and everything was okay again. But that's not how life works. We drifted apart, slowly but surely, until we were little more than strangers. And maybe that was for the best. Because some wounds don't heal. Some losses can't be undone. And sometimes, moving on isn't the same as forgetting. In the end, I learned that grief is not something you can rush through or pack away in boxes. Like old memories you're trying to forget. Losing Dad created a void that will never fully close. But I also realized I didn't need to let go of him to move forward with my life. Those boxes in storage, they aren't just things, they're pieces of him that I carry with me. And even if my relationship with Mom is forever changed, I'll always have the part of Dad that lives in my heart, untouched by time or by anyone's attempt to erase him.